The governor's plan for education has support from the legislature, but ultimately it's up to the voters.
We know this puts $3.5 billion in money into the base formula in K-12 education. That's what's important. We're going to stay focused on the goals.
How the state land trust works with respect to education.
The constitutional formula that governs the way the dollars are distributed to be greater so that there is more money going into K through 12.
This is Arizona Week. In May, voters will head to the polls for a special election, a plan put together by the governor and approved by the legislature. But it taps into the state land trust and requires changing language in the state constitution. On Wednesday, the governor went into detail about his plan. Governor, thank you so much for having us up here today.
Thanks for being here. Really appreciate it, Lorraine.
Take me back to negotiating this deal, and it's been a whirlwind for you, but you have some success on your end.
Well, it's been a whirlwind, and I think the success is for the state of Arizona, for our teachers, for our kids, for the entire focus and issue of education. You know, this lawsuit fell apart. They were trying to settle it, and I said during the State of the State, let's settle the lawsuit. It's time to stop paying lawyers and time to start paying teachers. We were hopeful that the legislature and the education community could figure this out, but when those discussions came apart, we went to the principals. We went to legislative leadership, and we went to the education champions. And I want to give a lot of credit out here to others. President Andy Biggs of the Senate, Speaker Gowan of the House, the education leaders from all different institutions came together. We brought people to a table. We had a lot of discussion. We had a lot of give and take. There was a lot of collaboration. And some weeks later, we were able to announce what we did on Friday afternoon, that we'll be putting $3.5 billion in new funds into K-12 education over the next 10 years. Now, we have to have success with the ballot box on May 17th, and that's a case we'll be making to voters, and that's the most important next step, but it was a real big win for the state of Arizona.
You had a lot of opposition from Democrats, the state treasurer, former treasurer. How did you sort of filter through all that to kind of keep your mind focused on that end goal?
We stayed focused on the end goal. We stayed focused on the result. We tried to stay out of the politics of this, stay on the policy, that our kids needed these dollars. And I'm the one who's really been out all over the state these past 11 months listening to teachers and listening to parents. And I'm someone who believes very much in reforms and accountability. But resources is also part of this equation. So what we did is made the decision to lead with resources, and we used the state land trust as the linchpin to bring everyone together and to drive these dollars while protecting the general fund and ensuring that these dollars would be there for our teachers and kids.
So you're tapping into the state land trust. Can you explain really how that works? Because it's not the most conventional thing that states tend to do. Is that correct?
Well, I'll simplify it because most states don't have it. Arizona's 103 years old, and in many ways the federal government entrusted the state with the land that existed here in the state of Arizona. So to simplify it, every time the state sells a piece of land, those dollars come back to be invested into perpetuity. That fund is at $5+ billion. That's a significant amount of money, and the state's land trust is intended to benefit K-12 education. So with this deal, what we have is that $5 billion working even harder on behalf of the kids that are in the classrooms today. The size of the trust will be worth even more 10 years from now than it is today, even though we're going to drive billions of dollars additional into K-12, and that's through better investments and through ongoing land sales. We have 9 million acres of state land that the state still has. That's a present value of $70 billion. So the state of Arizona has assets and attributes that other states simply don't have because we've been financially responsible. This is a responsible plan going forward, but it's going to drive millions and billions of dollars into K-12 education in this coming year, and it's something we're really excited about.
So this plan calls for selling state land?
No, this plan calls for taking the existing proceeds, the $5 billion, and really what are cash and cash-like instruments, the S&P 500, the S&P 400, the S&P 600 small cap, to take those dollars and to drive those into K-12 education, but to do it in a responsible way that actually allows the trust, the endowment, to be larger 10 years from now than it is today. It will not result in additional land sales that wouldn't happen otherwise.
So for people who are wondering, what does this do to the state landscape, to the existing lands? Nothing changes? People still have access to lands and...
Oh yes, absolutely. This would not be what you would call state land trust reform. This is just a better utilization of existing dollars.
The critics have said we don't have to use that money. Let's pull from the general fund. Your response on that?
I think the critics forget where our state was over the past 6 years. It has been a terrible downturn for the state of Arizona. We didn't have $1 in our checking account, no money in our rainy day fund. So we've had 6 months of positive results, and they say let's pass the punch bowl and party like it's 2006. That would be so irresponsible, and it would also not ensure funding going forward. What we're doing by combining the state land trust along with the current cash carry forward is ensure these dollars are there for K-12 education over the next 10 years. It is the more responsible way to do it, and it's a way that protects the general fund and also makes certain that there will be dollars there in the future rather than betting on a growing economy. Whether the economy goes up or down, these dollars will be there.
What happens after 10 years? Because we hear a lot of people saying we go into a fiscal cliff mode.
Well, we really don't go into a fiscal cliff mode. We'll be able to grow the state where the general fund will be able to sustain what we're doing today. But I also think it's important, remember, we're putting a significant amount of additional money into K-12 education. We want to make sure that money's being properly spent. We want to see proper results and outcomes. 3rd grade reading, 8th grade math, ACT scores, SAT scores, more graduations, fewer dropouts. We want to make sure we're going in the right direction. What that 10 years does is gives us a level of accountability to assess what we've done and say, can we do it better?
This puts approximately $200 to $300 per student more each year, is that correct?
I think I look at it on the total aggregate basis, but yes, it's a significant increase in per pupil funding. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars that will move into education in the next school year if we're successful on May 17th.
And that still keeps Arizona per pupil spending toward the bottom.
Well, I think there's a number of things here. Arizona will lead the country in terms of additional dollars. Well, we'll be a top state in terms of new dollars that we're putting into K-12 education. That's something to be very proud of. But I think it's also important to not make spending the measure of success in K-12 education. If spending were the measure of success, Newark, New Jersey, Washington, D.C., Detroit, Michigan, Chicago, Illinois, these would be the finest K-12 systems in the country, except they're not. They are the worst. So we're going to put these resources in. We're going to focus on what we already know how to do in this state, and that's educate a child. We have 3 of the top 10 public high schools in the nation in the state of Arizona. When I go back to the National Governors Association, and we have all 50 governors, and they point out who does excellence better than any other state, we have a spotlight that's shining on Arizona. We want to do that more often in more locations. That's what these resources are for.
Which schools are those? I'm not familiar with them. Here in Phoenix?
Well, it really began in Tucson. The Basis school system is the school that leads the nation. University High in Tucson is also another, and then Basis Scottsdale. And these are the top 10 in the nation, but we have dozens of schools that are right there or knocking on the door of these schools, both traditional K-12 and public charters. So we know how to do this, and we're not just doing it in 3 schools, we're doing it in many schools, but there are places in our low-income areas, high free and reduced lunch and tribal areas where we need help, and these resources are really going to go a long way. In addition to so many other places, even a good school can do so much more with these additional resources.
This funding plan goes to the voters in May.
Yes.
What is the backup plan should voters decide this is not what's best for the state?
This is Plan A, Plan B, and Plan C. This is going to be Proposition 1, 2, 3. We're going to put the full focus of the business community, the education champions, the people that care about our kids and teachers on this. It's going to be hard work. It's going to be a heavy lift. but we're going to have success at the ballot box on May 17th.
Last week I spoke with some of the Democratic caucus members, and they say this plan was pushed through much too quickly. How do you respond to that?
I don't think it's too soon to help our kids who have been through a tough time through this downturn. I'd like to move more quickly here. So no, I don't think it was too fast. We went through the legislative process. We came out in the summer with the State Land Trust Fund, and now we've been able to settle the lawsuit through collaboration with legislative leadership and the education community. The only regret I have is that we didn't do it more quickly.
Final thoughts for the voters who are going to be watching this unfold over the next few months and hearing a lot of things from either side of the spectrum here.
Well, there's going to be a real opportunity for our voters to say yes to funding our schools. This is $3.5 billion additional for our teachers, for our kids. It's responsive to the needs of our parents, and we're able to do all of it without raising taxes. It's really good policy, and we think it'll be a real positive for the state of Arizona, and I hope people will vote yes. But we'll talk a lot between now and May 17th.
Will it change Arizona's landscape in Arizona education, how the rest of the country sees us?
Well, that's going to be how we communicate this. This is going to be in addition to what we're doing from an economic perspective. We know the success we had with last year's Super Bowl. We've got the college football playoff national championship here this year. We've got the NC2A basketball championship. We have all the unique visitors that come to Phoenix and Tucson and everywhere else in our great state. Now that we're going to be leading the country in additional investment in K-12 education, I think that's just another feather in our cap.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
As you heard the governor say, the plan includes tapping into the State Land Trust. Former State Land Commissioner Vanessa Hickman explains how the State Land Trust functions.
The State Land Trust, the way the lands were granted to the state of Arizona, they were granted originally through an act of Congress when Arizona became a territory. And then the second land grant was made when Arizona entered statehood. And so you had a grand total of approximately 10 million acres of land, the majority of which was to be held in trust for the benefit of K-12 education. So Congress understood that the western states needed a mechanism in which they could help support public education. So there were land grants throughout the western United States that occurred in those states at the time that they became states as well. And with Arizona, pursuant to the Arizona-New Mexico Enabling Act, the lands were granted to be held in trust for the benefit of K-12, the universities, and some other beneficiaries.
So the land can be leased and all those proceeds go towards schools?
Yes, so the lands can be leased or they can be sold. And anything over 10 years must go to public auction. So if you're looking at a long-term lease, which is anything over 10 years, it must be advertised, appraised, and auctioned at no less than the appraised land value. And then the same with a land sale. So that also must be appraised, and the opening bid must be no less than the appraised land value. It is then held at a public auction where there is bidding, and the land is awarded to the highest and best bidder.
As a former state land commissioner, how much money is actually being generated each year for the state through these lands?
Sure. So the agency is a market-driven agency, and it makes decisions based on what is reasonable and what is the right time to sell or lease a piece of property. So in a down market, it often doesn't make sense to sell state trust land because the appraised land value would be relatively low. And the land department does not have any holding costs, so the ability to hold on to that land for a time when it's market ready and additional revenue can be generated for the beneficiaries, that is often what the land department elects to do. They can make a decision to put a premium on the appraised land value so that they could justify selling land at a time when there's a depressed market, as long as the trust is compensated adequately.
In this school funding discussion, we hear the opposition say you're raiding the state trust lands, and then we hear the other side saying we're tapping the state trust land. What is the difference? How exactly does that look?
So at the end of the day, the state land commissioner and the land department serve as trustees for the beneficiaries. And their responsibility is to make judicious and prudent decisions in line with the legal obligations of a trustee and represent the beneficiary's interest. With the land department's activities, the revenue that they generate, if it is more revenue by additional land sales or higher valuation on the land that they're selling, it stands to reason that the distribution to the beneficiaries would be greater because there would be more money in the corpus of the trust that the constitutional formula would apply to and that could be distributed to the beneficiaries. So the funding mechanism should not alter the way the trustee looks at the way they're selling land. It has to be done in a way that is generating the best return for the beneficiaries. But it also is an opportunity for the constitutional formula that governs the way the dollars are distributed to be greater so that there is more money going into K through 12.
People have been very skeptical of touching the state constitution. As a former land commissioner and for people approaching this May special election, what should they be watching for, or what should they be looking into to care about for the state and its landscape?
So making sure that the amendment to the Constitution is tailored to meet the very needs that are expressed in the language of that will be on the ballot. So making sure that it is not something that turns into a greater proposal than what has been discussed publicly. There's always a danger when you're looking at the land department and the state trust lands based on multiple different interests that there could be a greater proposal than what has been discussed in the past. And so it's just making sure that what has been supported publicly by many and what has been expressed publicly actually translates into what is put on the ballot. So, that was always one of the thoughts that I had and that other commissioners have had is anytime you look at a constitutional amendment or look at opening up the Enabling Act, then there's an opportunity for additional information and additional purposes to become part of that package, which are outside of what was originally anticipated.
Taking more dollars from the State Land Trust for education is complex. Here's Dan Hunting, a senior policy analyst at the Morrison Institute for Public Policy.
It's an interesting and novel approach to funding education. There's been some discussion, of course, about what's the right amount to take out of the permanent land trust, but this is certainly something that is a new way to get funding into the schools. In the big picture, I think it's important to remember that first of all, this is not new funding. This is just settling a lawsuit over funding that was improperly withheld a few years ago. And in any case, in the grand scheme of things, it's not a large increase in funding for education.
When you say take out from the State Land Trust, what exactly does that look like? How do you take money out of the State Land Trust?
Well, when trust land is sold, the money from that goes into an account, into the Permanent Land Trust Endowment Fund. And the state is not allowed to use all that money. They can't spend that. They can essentially only spend the interest on that, the gains that are made off of that over time. There is some evidence that over the past few years, not enough money has been taken out of that fund and that there's an excess built up there. So this plan would take out that excess funding and turn it over education. The debate here is really about, is it too much or too little? What's the level that should be taken out? There's been some vigorous discussion about that.
When voters go to the polls in May for that special election, what exactly will they be voting for, in plain English?
They will be voting to increase the amount of money that can be taken out of that fund from 2.5% to 6.9% for 10 years. There are also several other things going on in that. There are triggers that would allow the legislature to suspend the currently required inflation adjustments for education. Education funding is supposed to increase with inflation every year to make allowances for inflation. This would allow the legislature to suspend those increases under several sets of circumstances. And that may be an issue. The constitutional requirements for amending the Constitution through these initiatives say that the measure before the voters has to cover only one topic. It could be argued on this that there are more than one topics that are being presented in Proposition 1, 2, 3. There's the disbursements from the Land Trust Fund, which is one, and then these triggers are a related but really separate issue, I think it could be argued. So it'll be interesting to see if there's any pushback on that.
This does tinker with the corpus of the trust, is that correct?
Well, that depends upon who you talk to. There's been some discussion about that. The governor, of course, says that it does not tinker with the corpus, and that even if it did tinker with the corpus, he would not need to go to Congress to ask approval to do that. There are others that say, yes, it most definitely does breach the corpus of the trust, and that if that happens, we need to go and seek changes to the States Enabling Act, which would require an act of Congress, which is, of course, much more difficult to do.
Will there be litigation as a result of all this, regardless of which way the voters decide?
That's a good question. I've been involved over the past several months, this has been in discussion. I've been in a number of email discussions with lawyers who do not have a side in this, in a partisan way, one way or another, and they are arguing back and forth about whether or not this does or does not invade the corpus of the trust and what are the requirements there. And they have not been able to come to a clear decision. That leads me to think that if someone were to litigate this, that they would have a good chance, that there's an opportunity for that. I don't know that anybody is actually going to go forward with that, but that's certainly a possibility.
From an outsider's perspective, looking at the policy of this, do you think it's a good decision for the state?
I think it is a good decision to take some of the excess out of the Permanent Land Trust Fund. I am not sure whether that 6.9% is the right amount or not. That's a complicated decision that's going to take some looking at, I think, to decide.
What should voters be looking for as this unfolds over the next few months before May?
Well, I think they need to think really hard about how we fund education in the state. The question here is, are we tapping into future revenues for education to pay for today's needs? And is that a good idea or not? Are we sacrificing our future education funding for the sake of dealing with a problem that was caused by the legislature taking away this money several years ago? And is that a good idea or not? So I think that's the kind of question the voters are going to have to ask themselves as they go to the ballot box.
Proposition 123 will be on the ballot in a May special election. Here's Secretary of State Michelle Reagan.
Special election indeed. It was an election that we weren't planning on having next year, but we're certainly excited that we are having it. Next year we're planning on having the general election in November, and then the primaries in August, and then of course the presidential preference election in March. This is a special election in May, and so we're going to be having 4 big elections next year. We will be preparing for all 4 of them. Statewide elections cost about $10 million, so this is about a $9.3 million affair, and it involves a lot of preparation. Printing of the ballots, printing of the publicity pamphlets, educating voters on what they will be voting on this special election versus the other elections, a lot of outreach, and making sure people's voter registration is updated, and if they want to vote early, that they're on those lists. So a lot of preparation is going to be involved.
And just to clarify, regardless of your party affiliation, you can participate in this May special election.
Yes, absolutely. Everybody who's a registered voter can participate in the special election, which is May 17th, 2016. And we would like to see everybody who's eligible to vote get out there and become a voter.
Tell me a little bit about financing the special election, the cost structure for counties.
Well, we at the Secretary of State's office oversee all the elections, but it's actually the counties that administer the elections. So they do all the printing, all the mailing, they do really the heavy lifting. And one of the things we were really pleased about in this past legislative session was that the legislature wisely put in the legislation the ability to kind of change the structure of how the printing and the delivery of the ballots can happen. And let me just give you an example how that works just in Pima County. They're giving the counties the ability to save some money, which is great because we know that counties are really strapped for cash right now. So in changing the way that the ballot delivery system happens from precincts, which is just neighborhoods, if you will, to more of a congressional-based delivery system, without getting too detailed, just changing that ability saves Pima County about $50,000. That was something we suggested to the legislature. They added that in the legislation, and that's great because, again, it's a big money saver for Pima County and all the other counties as well. So when you're talking about $10 million, every little bit helps. $50,000 savings in Pima County is going to be huge.
There will be people for this plan and people for or who are against it. When does that language really start to take shape and then get forwarded onto your office?
We expect to see the organization that is going to be supporting Proposition 123. We expect that they'll probably be filing a statement of organization for their campaign shortly. And then if there is any opposition or organized opposition, they have to come in and file for a campaign. All of the letters or statements that will go in a publicity pamphlet, those are all due pro and con by December 4th of this year. And then the responsibility for printing the actual pamphlet and sending it out to voters, that falls on the Secretary of State's office. And we will be doing that for the counties, actually, to save a little bit more money for the counties. So it's all going to come up pretty quick here, but the deadline is December 4th.
There are a lot of people who sometimes think that special elections are bothersome. You know, they don't make the time for that. What would you say to them as the Secretary of State about the importance of participating this spring?
Oh, this one is very important. It's called a special election for a reason because it is special. Anytime that we decide to put something on the ballot statewide and spend the amount of money and the amount of resources that we're putting into it, it's because it is something that we're investing a lot of time and attention in for a reason.
And that's our program. Next week, a tribute to veterans, plus Congresswoman Martha McSally. For all of us at Arizona Public Media, I'm Lorraine Rivera.